Hello and welcome to the Washington Week Webcast Extra. I'm joined around the table by Tom Gelton of NPR, John Harwood of CNBC and the New York Times, Karen Tumulty of the Washington Post, and David Sanger of the New York Times. While we were consumed with North Korea and Cuba and the annual Washington holiday rush to the exits, a lot else was going on in the world. In Pakistan, more than 140 were killed in a Taliban attack on a school in Peshawar. All but 9 were children. In Sydney, Australia, a man described as a lone wolf took hostages in a chocolate cafe. The unpredictability of it all was a reminder that whether organized or carried out by individuals, terrorism is real, and the first call for help almost always comes to the U.S. How worried is the U.S. government about this kind of widespread, all over the world, little pops of terrorism? The president has actually made that point, that we're always in the lead.
We are usually in the lead, and he's also made the point, wouldn't it be nice if some others would take in that lead? Now, Pakistan was an example of an old problem that we've had for a long time. The TTP, which is the Pakistani Taliban, came in, did this horrific attack, which they said was in retaliation for the Pakistani government going up and cleaning out areas that Pakistan's never really controlled. But it was a reminder that on the very weeks that we're ending our combat mission completely and pulling all but 10,000 troops out of Afghanistan, the region itself and that border area is basically as violent as it was in the weeks after we went in 2001. And it raises a lot of questions about the stability of the Pakistani government.
I think I found interesting, among the things I found interesting about the Australia hostage taking was we have now seen in Dubai, we've seen in Canada, where lone wolves, or we think that they're acting alone, have taken these out of the blue actions, whether killing a woman, an American in a restroom, or killing a Canadian soldier just standing duty. Do people who are expert in this see a link?
Well, they see a link, but they don't see an organization. So in the Australia case, even in the Canadian case, there's no particular evidence that anybody was centrally commanding them to go do this, unlike those cases like the Times Square bomber or the airplane plots where you think that there was an attack on the United States that was organized centrally. But that also makes these almost impossible to pick up, because if they're not centrally organized, you're not going to hear that phone call or see that computer transmission that might give you a chance to prevent them. And, you know, in the Australian case, there are going to be a lot of questions asked because the suspect in this case who was killed in the shootout at the end was known and had been charged in a number of assault cases and was on everybody's list and yet was still walking free.
I want to go back a little bit to revisit the Cuba story here, two different pieces of it, both what happens after the fact. In this case domestically, Cold War politics, as you wrote about this week, Karen, has always been a feature of our relationship with Cuba, with a lot of places, but with Cuba it's been now, it's still been present. It never went away. And with the release of Alan Gross and with the shifting that's going on in domestic politics, it feels like we have turned a corner.
And in fact, the corner started to be turned even over a decade ago when polling started for the first time when people were asked, should we resume diplomatic relations with Cuba? About 10, 12 years ago, public sentiment in favor of doing it for the first time began to exceed the sentiment opposed to it. And we've also seen...
Not just among people of Cuban heritage.
No, this is nationally. But among Cuban Americans, the younger generation has been much more open to this idea and much more open to voting for Democrats. So President Obama in 2012 actually won the Cuban American vote nationally by 2 percentage points, and he carried the Cuban American vote in Miami. Now, I do think the big question going forward is likely to be, how much has this put Florida in jeopardy, but also how much are the Republicans going to be able to weave a narrative that President Obama didn't negotiate a good deal, that he negotiated from a power of weakness, and this is sort of yet another argument that he has not been a strong and steadfast leader in the world.
And Tom, I want to talk a little bit about what happens on the island. It feels like we're in a post-Castro moment, even though we've been waiting, it feels, for months for Castro to actually leave the scene. Fidel and his brother, who also is incredibly long-lived, is still on the scene. But it feels like politically and I don't know, culturally almost, that we're in a post-Castro period.
Well, actually, Raul Castro has said that he will step down in 2018. That's only 3 years from now. Right. So, 55 years of Castro brothers and only at the most 3 more. And this, I think, this deal that he has struck with the United States has to be seen in that light. I mean, he is now recognizing that the next leader of Cuba will be somebody who did not have historic ties to the revolution. And meanwhile, Venezuela and the Soviet Union, the 2 major patrons of Cuba over all these years, are both, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, Russia doesn't provide that much help, and Venezuela is in no position to continue providing the kind of help that they have provided. So clearly, Cuba has to be integrated into the world in a way it never was before, economically and to some extent politically.
And John, I want to wrap up by talking about the president's year-end press conference. Every year about this time, every Friday, before he escapes to Hawaii and gets away from the rest of us, he comes out and says, these are all the things that went right. Now, I recall a year ago him looking exhausted, barely getting the words out, having a really hard time making the case. He seemed to have a little spring in his step today, and a few more examples.
He did, and I think the foremost reason for that, even though it may not have been the dominant focus of the press conference today, is the fact that the economy really has completed its recovery from the Great Recession. 314,000 jobs created in November. People expect a strong December as well. The growth trajectory of the economy is pretty solid right now. Now, that doesn't mean the economic job is done, and the president made that point in the news conference, because while we have recovered in a cyclical way from the downturn, we haven't really done anything to raise the long-term living standards of average people. In fact, they've stagnated for more than 30 years.
2 interesting things the president said today that caught my ear. One was about the state of the auto industry, which we know was on the brink of collapse not terribly long ago, that they repaid everything that they were loaned in the bailout. And the other thing he talked about was gas prices, which if gas prices had gone as high as they've gone low, the president would be run out of town on the rail, yet I don't hear that much about it.
No question. There are actually 3 things going on in the economy which are quite beneficial. One of them is the moderation in medical costs, which we've seen over the last several years. So we had much slower healthcare inflation, and we've seen a general moderation in energy prices, and now the really nosedive down of gas prices. That's like a tax cut for average families. Right. So again, that doesn't solve the problem of middle-class families being able to expect better living standards for their children than they've had. There's still a lot of debate, and an accelerating debate, really. It'll be a big part of the 2016 campaign. What are we going to do long-term? But right now, things are much, much better than they were.
It allows the president to go off for 17 days of golf and not feel so bad about it. Mahalo, Mr. President. Mm-hmm. Thanks, everyone. If you're dying for more, be sure to check out our online feature, The Vault, where you'll find out what Tom Jelton had to say about the Castro regime on Washington Week back in 2009. And he looks the same. And we'll see you here next time on the Washington Week Webcast Extra.